Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with my usual quick reminder to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and leave a comment. Also, I keep forgetting to mention this, but there's also the hype button now too, so that's yet another button you can tap to help me out in the algorithm. With all that said, let's get down to business and discuss some unsolved mysteries. In 1999, at the absolute peak of a professional athlete's career, one of the NBA's rising stars did the unthinkable. At just 30 years old, Bison DeLay, the highest paid player on the Detroit Pistons, abruptly retired. He walked away from the remaining 5 years and $36.45 million on his contract. To the sports world, it was an act of inexplicable madness. To DeLay, it was the only logical thing to do. DeLay was a 6 foot 10 inch, 260-pound center who had won a championship with Michael Jordan's 1997 Chicago Bulls. Yet he was also a sensitive intellectual who arrived at team practices on a skateboard. He was a bookworm who devoured texts on art and philosophy. He was a lover of Nietzsche, and an accomplished musician proficient in the saxophone, trumpet, and violin. He was an adventurer who ran with the Bulls in Pamplona, held a pilot's license, and loved to skydive. He was also a man of deep complexity, having recovered from depression and an attempt to end it all in 1992. Early retirement, according to Bison, would allow him to just focus on living. In the end, this led him to a 55-foot catamaran in the South Pacific, where his new life and the lives of 2 others would be stolen. DeLay's ultimate dream was freedom on the open water. After traveling the world, he learned to sail and purchased a large catamaran, which he docked for a time in New Zealand at Auckland's West Haven Marina. He named the vessel the Hakuna Matata, a famous Swahili phrase for no worries that was popularized by 2 singing animals in a Disney movie. It was a floating, 55-foot declaration of his new philosophy. He was embarking on the beginning of a new story, and he wasn't alone. He was joined by his 30-year-old girlfriend, Serena Carlin. Born in New York and raised in Berkeley, she was described as the quintessential flower child. She was creative, shy, and adventurous in her own right, having befriended Prince and managed his charities before trying her hand as a makeup artist and a New York real estate agent. After the September 11th attacks left her depressed and wanting to leave the city, DeLay invited her to join him. The third person on the voyage was Bertrand Saldo, 32. Saldo wasn't a guest, but a professional. A French skipper DeLay had hired to captain the large catamaran on its long journey. Together, the 3 of them had formed a small, idyllic community on the Hakuna Matata, living the life DeLay had purchased by leaving behind his basketball career. This idyllic scene wasn't built to last. A 4th person joined the boat, DeLay's older brother, Miles DeBoard, 35. DeBoard, born Kevin Williams, was a computer programmer from California and the dark variable in DeLay's new life. The brothers' relationship was notoriously volatile, described by friends and family as frequently at odds. The jealousy and conflict weren't a secret. A previous crew member on the Hakuna Matata had actually quit, unable to stand the constant fighting between the 2 brothers. His presence on the final trip was a source of immediate and palpable tension. He had turned up uninvited in New Zealand earlier in the year, starting arguments before leaving. When he returned to join the boat for the trip to Tahiti, Serena Carlin made her discomfort known. DeLay, the younger brother, was a famous, wealthy, and successful athlete. DeBoard wasn't any of these things. He had financial difficulties and a strong jealous streak, despite his brother giving him more than 6 figures in cash over the years, in gifts and quote-unquote loans. These loans were of course a fiction to preserve Miles DeBoard's ego, and he had no intention of ever repaying them. On July 6, 2002, the Hakuna Matata sailed from Tahiti. On board were the four individuals: Bison DeLay, Serena Carlin, Bertrand Saldo, and Miles DeBoard. The boat was scheduled to sail to Honolulu. The last known communications from anyone on the vessel were a series of satellite phone calls made on July 8th. After that, the boat, and the three people DeLay's family and friends knew to be on it, went silent. The silence was the first piece of evidence. DeLay and Carlin were in regular contact with their families and their banks. While Carlin had warned her friends she might be out of touch for up to a month due to the remote location, her friends and family became worried. The first concrete sign of what had happened came nearly 2 weeks after the last call. On July 18, 2002, Miles DeBoard was seen docking the 55-foot catamaran at a port in Taravao, Tahiti. Disturbingly, he was alone. The investigative trail DeBoard left was clumsy, arrogant, and damning. When French authorities and the FBI located the catamaran, they found its nameplate had been ripped off. DeBoard had attempted to re-register the vessel under a new name, the Aria Bella. Witnesses reported seeing DeBoard, alone on the renamed boat, throwing large sacks from the deck into a garbage can. Authorities later recovered clothing and diving suits from the bags. A forensic team, decked out head to toe in protective suits, boarded the vessel. Their search confirmed the family's worst fears. They discovered what they believed were bloodstains. Even more chilling, they found what appeared to be bullet holes that had been crudely patched and painted over. They also found residue from a large caliber weapon. DeBoard, meanwhile, had fled French Polynesia. On September 5th, 2002, he surfaced in Phoenix, Arizona, in the most brazen way imaginable. He was attempting to buy $150,000 in gold coins from a bullion dealer. To make the purchase, he was actively impersonating his missing brother. He presented DeLay's passport as his own identification and signed receipts using DeLay's birth name, Brian Williams. Police were alerted and detained DeBoard on suspicion of fraud. Inexplicably, after a few hours, they released him. They couldn't, at that moment, disprove DeBoard's claim that his brother had authorized the transaction, since his brother was only missing. It was the last time he would be seen by law enforcement. DeBoard collected the passport and vanished, fleeing to Mexico. With DeBoard on the run, his ex-girlfriend Erica Weiss went to the FBI. She recounted the story DeBoard had told her, providing the world with the first of two competing theories about what happened on the Hakuna Matata. The first theory is DeBoard's own elaborate self-defense confession. As Weiss told the Los Angeles Times, DeBoard claimed a fight broke out between him and DeLay. Serena Carlin tried to intervene and was accidentally knocked down, hitting her head on a part of the boat and dying instantly. This led to a cascade of violence. In his main version of the story, the captain, Bertrand Saldo, wanted to report Carlin's death, which Miles DeBoard claimed sent DeLay into a panic. DeBoard alleged that DeLay then slew Saldo to silence him. This led to a final life-or-death struggle between the brothers, which ended when DeBoard shot DeLay in self-defense. He then admitted to taking the three bodies and dumping them overboard into the Pacific. If his story was to be believed, it was a disturbing tragedy of errors and crimes, with DeBoard as the sole traumatized survivor. This theory, of course, leaves a lot to be desired, since it portrayed DeBoard as likely legally innocent. If he was responsible for Carlin's death, it was an accident when she tried to break them up. If he shot his brother, it was because he was going to eliminate him to cover up the slaying of the skipper. The second theory, the one held by the authorities, is one of a cold, premeditated triple slaying. Investigators believed the motive was simple: financial gain. The FBI's case was built on evidence that directly contradicted DeBoard's story. First, there was the gold buying scheme, which showed intent to steal DeLay's assets. However, this could potentially be dismissed as an unethical and illegal action taken after the fact. The next part couldn't. Second, and most damning, the FBI found Dabord had purchased approximately $200 of dumbbell weights from a Rebel sports store in Auckland, New Zealand, before the final voyage. The FBI suspected these weren't for exercise. They were purchased with the specific intent to weigh down the bodies. This single purchase suggested premeditation, shattering the self-defense narrative. Further evidence came from satellite phone records. On July 8th, likely right after the attacks, Dabord placed a call to a mystery woman in New Zealand he had befriended. The authorities were able to get the records of the call, but disturbingly, he didn't mention anything whatsoever about what had happened. The manhunt for Miles Dabord, the only person in the world who knew the truth, ended on September 14th, 2002. He was found unconscious in Tijuana, Mexico, and transported to a hospital in Chula Vista, California. He was admitted as a John Doe, unidentified and in a deep coma. The cause was a massive, intentional overdose of insulin, which, combined with his failure to take his asthma medication, had caused catastrophic and irreversible brain damage. Before his overdose, Dabord had placed a final crying phone call to his mother. He offered a last, cryptic version of events, telling her that he found out the truth about something, but that no one would believe him. He told her that he couldn't survive in prison, but that he was completely innocent. On September 27th, 2002, Miles Dabord died, less than 3 months after his brother had vanished. He was the only person who could have told investigators what truly happened on the Hakuna Matata, and he took that secret to his grave. With the death of the sole suspect and witness, the active investigation into the triple slaying effectively ended. The bodies of Bison DeLay, Serena Carlin, and Bertrand Saldo have never been recovered. The case remains a profound, chilling, and technically unresolvable mystery. We're left with only the conflicting stories of a dead man and the cold, hard evidence of a crime. Patched bullet holes, bloodstains on a renamed boat, and a set of dumbbell weights purchased in Auckland. The rest of the truth, like the victims themselves, was lost at sea. In a final tragic testament to the case's impossible, tangled grief, a memorial service was eventually held for both brothers by the family. In the mid-19th century, scientists faced a riddle that defied easy explanation. They had found fossils of lemurs, small, monkey-like primates, in India. Living lemurs, however, were solely concentrated on the island of Madagascar, thousands of miles away. The strangest part was that there was no trace of them, living or fossilized, in the vast intervening lands of mainland Africa or the Middle East. In a world that didn't yet understand plate tectonics, this biogeographical puzzle left scientists baffled. In 1864, a respected British zoologist named Philip Lutley Scalater offered a solution. In a paper titled The Mammals of Madagascar, he proposed that a vast continent must have once existed in the Indian Ocean, connecting India and Madagascar. This massive land bridge would have allowed the lemurs to migrate freely. After it served its evolutionary purpose, he theorized, this landmass sank beneath the waves. He gave this hypothetical continent a fitting name, Lemuria. It was a simple, logical, and elegant scientific hypothesis. It was also completely wrong. But the idea Scalater unleashed was far too powerful to be undone by mere facts. His thought had just been born, and it was about to begin one of the strangest journeys in the history of ideas. And trust me, this hypothesis about lemurs would go to some very crazy and very non-lemur related places really quickly. It's important to understand that Scalator's idea wasn't fringe for its time. It was actually considered quite brilliant and progressive. In the Victorian era, proposing sunken continents and land bridges was a perfectly respectable scientific tool. Without an understanding of continental drift, geologists and biologists used these geographies to explain all sorts of anomalies in rock formations and species distribution across the globe. Scalator, a serious and prolific zoologist, was just engaging in standard scientific practice. But his idea was quickly adopted and radically transformed by another more famous scientist. Ernst Haeckel, a prominent German biologist, was a fierce advocate for Darwin's new theory of evolution. Haeckel was obsessed with finding the missing link, the fossil evidence of a proto-human that would bridge the gap between apes and modern Homo sapiens. The embarrassing lack of such fossils was a major vulnerability for the theory. Haeckel seized upon Scalator's Lemuria as the perfect solution. In his 1876 book, The History of Creation, he proposed that Lemuria was not just a bridge for lemurs, but the very cradle of humanity. Also, I miss the days when scientists and historians could unironically name their works, The History of Creation, and just run with it. But I digress. His reasoning was simple. If humanity evolved on a continent that was now at the bottom of the Indian Ocean, it would perfectly explain why we couldn't find any fossils. In his maps, Haeckel confidently labeled this sunken landmass Eden and showed the various human races migrating from this single origin point to populate the rest of the globe. With Haeckel's influential backing, Lemuria made its first great pivot. It was no longer a niche zoological hypothesis, but a grand theory of human origins. Haeckel's scientific stamp of approval made Lemuria irresistible to a group that had no interest in lemurs, but a profound interest in lost cradles of humanity. This is where the myth truly took flight, thanks to one of the 19th century's most enigmatic and influential figures, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. Blavatsky was the co-founder of the Theosophical Society, a mystical religious movement that blended Eastern philosophy with Western esotericism. In her 1888 magnum opus, The Secret Doctrine, she unveiled a complex and sweeping history of the cosmos and humanity's evolution. But Blavatsky's Lemurians were nothing like Scalator's primates or Haeckel's missing links. They were giants, described as standing 12 to 15 feet tall. They were androgynous or hermaphroditic, laid eggs, and possessed a third eye in the back of their heads, which gave them psychic abilities. This was the myth's most important transformation. Blavatsky and the Theosophists had successfully severed Lemuria from any testable scientific claim. Its history was no longer accessible through geology or fossil hunting, but only through clairvoyant readings of the Akashic records. The hypothesis had become an article of faith, making it completely immune to any future scientific debunking. But back to Scalator's original puzzle. Science did eventually find the answer, and it was just as fantastic as Lemuria, but true. The theory of continental drift, or plate tectonics, which was proposed in 1912 and finally accepted in the 1960s, rendered the Lemuria hypothesis obsolete. Notably, when German geophysicist Alfred Wegener proposed this theory, his ideas were considered completely non-scientific. Interestingly, the new theory confirmed that Scalator's observation was correct. Madagascar and India had been connected. But they weren't a continent that sank. They were part of the ancient supercontinent Gondwanaland. They didn't sink. They drifted apart. The fatal flaw in Scalator's theory was the timeline. The breakup that separated India from Madagascar occurred roughly 80 to 90 million years ago. This was millions of years before the first lemurs or any other primates had even evolved. They couldn't have walked across a land bridge. The real solution to the riddle of the lemurs is believed to be oceanic dispersal. Scientists theorize that millions of years ago, a small group of ancestral lemurs was swept out to sea from mainland Africa, perhaps on a large mat of vegetation during a storm. By a 1 in a billion chance, they survived the 560-kilometer journey and landed on the isolated island of Madagascar, where, free from competition, they evolved. By the time science provided this definitive, evidence-based answer, it didn't matter. The myth of Lemuria had long since escaped the laboratory. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here once again with a quick reminder about the importance of the notification bell. So if you haven't clicked it yet, don't forget to do so. Also, if you've got the means to do so and you're feeling generous, feel free to help out my channel through a YouTube membership or the Patreon. On October 31st, 2002, Chris Jenkins went out to celebrate Halloween with friends at the Lone Tree Bar and Grill in Minneapolis. He was dressed in a costume and was accompanied by his girlfriend and another couple. Around midnight, Jenkins was reportedly ejected from the bar by bouncers. In the process, he became separated from his friends and left behind his coat, wallet, and cell phone inside the bar on a cold night. A bouncer saw him walk away from the bar, turning left onto Hennepin Avenue, but after that point, Chris vanished into the darkness. When he didn't return home, his family and friends grew alarmed, and a massive search effort began. For days and then weeks, volunteers and police searched for any sign of Chris. Sadly, nearly 4 months later, on February 27th, 2003, a body recovery team found Chris Jenkins's remains in the Mississippi River. His body had become snagged on debris near the 3rd Avenue Bridge not far from St. Anthony Falls in Minneapolis. Chris was still wearing his Halloween costume when his body was discovered. An autopsy determined the cause of death to be drowning, but investigators couldn't initially determine how it happened. With no obvious signs of severe trauma and a blood alcohol level above the legal limit in his system, police theorized that Chris's death was likely a tragic accident, or even his own work. They suggested he might have become intoxicated and fallen from a nearby bridge into the river, perhaps upset after an argument with his girlfriend earlier in the evening. By 2004, the Minneapolis Police Department had closed the case, concluding that no foul play was involved. To Chris's family, however, this conclusion was unacceptable. They felt that critical evidence had been overlooked and that the investigation was prematurely closed. The Jenkins family never believed Chris's death was an accident. Chris was a well-liked, responsible student with a promising future, and not someone who they believed was prone to reckless behavior or thoughts of going out voluntarily. Disturbed by what they saw as missteps in the investigation, his parents, Jan and Steve Jenkins, undertook their own efforts to find the truth. They hired private investigators and even independent experts to analyze the evidence. For example, one investigator found witnesses who reported seeing a group of men involved in an altercation outside a pizza shop across from the bar around the time Chris left. Their forensic experts noted that the condition of Chris's body was unusual for a drowning. He was found lying on his back with his arms crossed, his shirt still neatly tucked in, and even his slip-on shoes still on his feet. According to their forensic experts, typically, drowning victims are found face down with disheveled clothing and often missing shoes due to the struggle in water. To the Jenkins family, these details indicated that Chris may not have perished from an accidental fall into the river, but rather that his body had been placed in the water after death. In 2006, a new Minneapolis police chief took over leadership in the city and agreed to review the case at the family's urging. Around the same time, a breakthrough seemed to occur. detectives received a tip from a jailhouse snitch who claimed to have knowledge of Chris's death. This informant told police that he and another man had encountered Chris on a pedestrian walkway of the Hennepin Avenue Bridge and targeted him for a robbery. According to this account, Chris was an easy target because he was intoxicated and alone. When they found he had no valuables on him, one of the perpetrators became enraged and flung Chris over the railing of the bridge into the river. Based on this new information, the police chief officially reopened the investigation. On November 17, 2006, Minneapolis police held a news conference to announce that Chris Jenkins's manner of death was being reclassified as a slaying. With the case now treated as foul play related, investigators followed the new leads. They interviewed the jailed informant and searched for the other suspect mentioned in the bridge scenario. However, this line of investigation ran into problems. For one, the physical logistics of the alleged crime were questionable. The Hennepin Avenue Bridge has fairly high railings, and a single person throwing a strong, healthy young man over it would be difficult, though clearly not impossible. However, it was speculated that perhaps the jailhouse snitch had been more involved than he had let on to investigators, and that perhaps both men threw him over. However, the authorities would discover there was yet another problem. The Hennepin Avenue Bridge has a clearance of approximately 40 feet above the Mississippi River. Chris's autopsy revealed no broken bones or major injuries that one might expect from being dropped from significant heights. Forensic experts had significant doubts that his body wouldn't have experienced major trauma in such a fall. However, again, this didn't necessarily completely rule out the scenario. Doubts also arose because security cameras facing that bridge didn't show any altercation on the bridge on the night in question. Given that Chris disappeared after 2001, and given that the bridge was classified as critical infrastructure, there were numerous security cameras filming all angles of the bridge. Some investigators began to suspect that if Chris had been slain, it might have happened elsewhere, and his body was dumped in the river later, rather than directly thrown off that bridge. By 2007, police had a suspect's name and presented it to prosecutors. The Hennepin County Attorney's Office concluded there wasn't enough evidence to charge this suspect, or anyone else, in relation to Chris's case. To this day, the case remains open and unsolved, with investigators still hoping to find the evidence needed to ultimately hold someone accountable. In the absence of a definitive conclusion, a number of other theories have been proposed over the years to explain what might have happened to Chris Jenkins. And before I discuss it further, there are still people who remain unconvinced that this whole thing wasn't just an unfortunate drowning accident that took a young man too soon. Chris's family has advanced the theory that he was the victim of a more elaborate act of foul play that didn't involve an immediate fall from a bridge. They point to various pieces of evidence suggesting Chris was attacked near the bar shortly after he was kicked out, potentially knocked unconscious, and then transported to another location. The private investigator the family hired learned of a possible gang initiation happening outside a pizza restaurant across the street from the bar around the same time. The family theorizes that Chris could have been abducted in a van, held against his will, and possibly harmed for some time before his body was disposed of in the river. This would explain why his body appeared as if it had been placed gently in the water. That said, it doesn't explain why his body showed no signs of significant trauma. Jan Jenkins, Chris's mother, has speculated substantially about what happened to her son over the years, going beyond the abduction theory. For instance, she speculated that an off-duty police officer at the bar might have had a personal motive to orchestrate Chris's removal from the premises, to get access to his girlfriend. While this theory doesn't propose the officer was involved in the actual slaying, the theory is the involvement of a cop may have made the authorities quick to rule it an accidental death in 2023. She's also hinted at the disturbing possibility of a ritualistic or cult-related sacrifice, though this aspect remains highly speculative, to put it mildly. This appears to be largely based upon the fact that he disappeared on Halloween, and appears to be tied to the theory that he was abducted prior to being slain. Looking at the evidence from a strictly objective basis, the scenarios proposed by the family are very much speculative. That said, his family has speculated day in and day out as to what happened to him since Halloween 2022, and I'm sure they've run through absolutely every scenario imaginable. Another theory that was and is popular online is that he may be a victim of the so-called smiley face perpetrator. Without going down that rabbit hole, this is a highly speculative theory about a predator or group targeting young college-aged men. The theory is considered highly speculative, and Chris is one of the cases often cited in support of the pattern of this alleged perpetrator. Unfortunately, I think it's going to be extremely difficult to actually resolve this case at this time. The authorities didn't treat this case as a slaying initially, and simply investigated it as an accidental drowning. In the nearly 4 years it took for them to reclassify the case, untold quantities of evidence went stale or expired. At present, we don't know who the suspect was or why the authorities refused to prosecute this individual, so it's unclear what evidence, if any, is needed to resolve this case. Picture two thrones, and on the first sits a king, the very image of divine justice. Before him stand two women, each claiming to be the mother of a single infant. With a wisdom that seems to cut through the fabric of human deceit, the king calls for a sword, threatening to divide the child. His gambit works, revealing the true mother's heart and cementing his reputation as the wisest ruler who ever lived. This is King Solomon of the Bible, a figure revered in all the Abrahamic faiths for his unparalleled holiness and wisdom. Now picture a second throne, this one shrouded in the occult and inscribed with arcane symbols. The king who sits here is no less powerful, but his authority extends beyond the mortal realm. He stands within a protective circle, holding a glowing ring that bears an otherworldly seal. With words of power, he commands the groveling princes of hell, binding legions of demons to his will and forcing them to erect a temple of impossible grandeur. This too is King Solomon, the archetypal sorcerer and grand master of Western occultism. How did the celebrated king, whose wisdom was a mark of divine favor, transform into the legendary Magus, who could traffic with demons and command spirits? The legend of Solomon the magician didn't spring from nothing. The canonical biblical texts, while containing no explicit magic, planted the seeds from which a supernatural reputation could grow. These accounts provided the raw material, a narrative framework of divine gifts, immense knowledge, and moral ambiguity that later traditions would reinterpret. The story begins with a divine encounter. In a dream, God offers the newly crowned Solomon anything he desires. Instead of asking for the usual things like wealth, long life, or the defeat of his enemies, the young king asks for a mind to understand and govern his people. This selfless request pleases God so immensely that he not only grants Solomon wisdom unparalleled by any king before or after, but also bestowed him the riches he didn't request. This establishes a critical precedent. Solomon's extraordinary abilities are supernatural in origin, a direct endowment from the divine. The Bible then specifies the nature of this wisdom. It wasn't merely judicial or political, but rather in breadth of knowledge of everything from the natural world. He is known to have had immense knowledge of flora and fauna, the latter of which would later develop into the legend that he could directly converse with animals. Solomon's greatest worldly achievement, the construction of the first temple in Jerusalem, also provided fertile ground for folklore. The biblical account details a project of immense scale, requiring vast resources of timber, gold, and stone, and taking 7 years to complete. The sheer magnificence and logistical complexity of the temple fed into a persistent belief that such a feat couldn't have been accomplished by mortal labor alone. Combined with the understanding of this divine wisdom, this created a narrative opening for the idea of supernatural assistance. Finally, the Bible is unflinching in its account of Solomon's decline. In his later years, his 700 wives and 300 concubines, many from foreign lands, introduced their gods to the land. He allowed them to build shrines for the worship of their deities, drawing the wrath of God directly upon him. This act is perhaps the most crucial element in his transformation. In the eyes of the believer, it creates a moral ambiguity, a problem with an otherwise righteous king. This spiritual failing provides the perfect narrative justification for his later association with forbidden knowledge and the summoning of non-divine entities. It suggests a man who, despite his divine gifts, strayed into darker, esoteric realms. Notably, the biblical account, while rich in describing Solomon's wisdom and accomplishments, is conspicuously silent on the precise mechanics of his power, which will be important. If the Bible planted the seeds of Solomon's magical reputation, a curious text from late antiquity made them bloom. The Testament of Solomon is the foundational document that transforms the wise king into an arch-magician and provides the detailed backstory for his command over demons. This work, which isn't accepted as scripture in any Abrahamic faith, filled the narrative vacuum left by the biblical accounts with a vivid and systematic demonology. Written in Greek sometime around the 2nd century AD, the Testament is a pseudepigraphical work, meaning it was falsely attributed to Solomon himself to lend it authority. It's a fascinating blend of Jewish, Christian, and Greco-Roman magical traditions, reflecting the syncretic spiritual world in which it was born. The story of how Solomon bound the demons and made them his servants opens during the construction of the temple. A favored young servant is being tormented by a demon named Orneus, who steals half his pay and food and drains his life force by sucking his right thumb. And yeah, trust me, that'll be the least unusual thing about this entire story, so strap in. Distressed by his servant's decline, Solomon prays fervently in the temple for the power to subdue the demon. In answer to his prayer, the archangel Michael appears and gives him a small ring with a seal engraved upon it, the pentalpha, later known as the Seal of Solomon. This ring, Michael explains, is a gift from God that will allow him to seal all the demons that roam the earth. Solomon uses the ring to summon, interrogate, and bind a vast host of demons, basically playing an ancient history version of Shin Megami Tensei. The text functions as a veritable demonological manual, and he compels each spirit to reveal its name, its malevolent function, and its associated astrological body. Most importantly, he forces the demons to reveal the name of the angel or the divine phrase that can thwart its power. This process effectively categorized the demonic world, transforming demons from abstract forces of evil into a classified list of specific agents of affliction. Crucially, Solomon doesn't merely banish these demons, he claps them in spiritual cuffs and then puts them to work, against their will. According to this tale, he then used them in building the very temple whose construction had puzzled later generations. Each demon was assigned a specific task, which Solomon believed the creature to be uniquely suited for, based upon its malevolent purpose. The demon Orneus, for instance, is forced to cut stones, while the powerful Asmodeus is made to tread clay for the bricks. Other demons are tasked with everything from being job site gophers to overseeing parts of the project in their own right. And yeah, if you think your boss is bad, Just try to work for a demon who isn't doing the job willingly. This masterstroke of storytelling directly connects Solomon's magical power to his greatest biblical achievement, providing a supernatural explanation for its legendary grandeur. The Testament concludes by echoing the biblical account of Solomon's fall, but with a magical twist. Seduced by a foreign woman, he agrees to sacrifice to her gods. Solomon, ultimately being a faithful person, thought there would be no harm in a minor nominal sacrifice. However, with this act, all the gifts that God had given him departed, and he was left powerless to both humans and demons. The Testament of Solomon provided the narrative, but it was during the Middle Ages that this story was transformed into a system of practice. A new genre of texts emerged, the grimoire, or magical handbook. Falsely attributed to King Solomon to grant them an aura of ancient and holy authority, these books were not stories, but practical manuals for aspiring magicians. They promised to teach the very arts that the legendary king had mastered before he squandered it all. There was also another more pressing reason why these grimoires were tied to Solomon. If they weren't tied to someone of undoubted holiness, they could much more easily be construed as books composed of ancient and evil magic, in essence, regular illegal witchcraft. The most famous of these are the Key of Solomon and its later, more notorious offshoot, the Lesser Key of Solomon. Likely written in the 14th century in Italy and compiled from earlier medieval occult traditions, these works moved beyond folklore into codified ritual. They provided step-by-step instructions for everything the ceremonial magician needed. This included rites of personal purification, fasting, and prayer, as well as blueprints for crafting magical tools like wands, swords, and robes. There were, of course, lists of incantations and conjurations to summon and compel spirits to do the operator's will. The goals of these spells were generally focused on gaining power, gaining knowledge or wisdom, finding treasure, or falling in love. The first book of the Lesser Key, known as the Ars Goetia, became the definitive text on Solomonic demonology. It presents a highly organized and bureaucratic vision of the infernal realms. The text catalogs 72 specific demons, whom Solomon supposedly sealed with his magical ring. Each demon is assigned a rank within a complex feudal-style hierarchy reflective of medieval Europe. There are kings like Baal and Paimon, great princes of hell like Stolas, dukes like Barbados, amongst many others. And I know more than a few Genshin Impact players probably just had to pause the video right there for a second, because yeah, you heard that name correctly. For each of these 72 spirits, the Ars Goetia provides a unique sigil, or seal, a cryptic symbol that acts as the demon's spiritual signature and the key to its summoning. It also describes the demon's appearance and its specific powers, or the knowledge it can impart. For example, King Baal, the first spirit listed, can teach the art of invisibility, while President Marbas can cause and cure diseases and improve knowledge of machines. Notably, according to the book, the magician doesn't worship the demons. They beat them into submission spiritually, using divine and angelic powers, just like Solomon. The journey of King Solomon from a wise ruler to a master of demons is a testament to the power of storytelling and the enduring human desire to understand and control the unseen world. This Solomonic tradition became foundational to the development of Western ceremonial magic. By attributing their forbidden arts to a revered biblical king, magicians could frame their practice not as a wicked invention, but as a lost, sacred science. This act lent a crucial veneer of legitimacy to esoteric systems, allowing them to exist in a complex, symbiotic relationship with the mainstream religions from which they drew their power. Crucially, this air of legitimacy allowed the practice to be tolerated to a greater or lesser degree, even when other forms of magic ran the risk of the practitioner ending up on the stake.